Hey guys, tonight we begin with a question that's often forgotten amid the chaos of tanks, trenches, and total war. What did World War II soldiers actually eat? From American Creations to German Zot spread, Soviet cabbage soup to Japanese rice balls. Tonight, we're peeling back the layers of history, one can of corned beef at a time. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where asterisk you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Before a single shot was fired, before tanks rumbled across Europe or planes screamed overhead, every army faced one universal, unglamorous challenge, feeding its soldiers without killing them in the process. Let's be honest, when we think asterisk of World War II, we imagine battles, bravery, and black and white newsreels. Rarely do we stop to ask the really gritty questions, like, did that guy storming Normandy have breakfast? And if so, what on earth was it? Spoiler, it wasn't pancakes. Feeding millions of men across continents wasn't just a culinary experiment. It was a logistical nightmare with a side of dysentery. Rations had to be portable, non-perishable, cheap, and preferably not make you cry after eating them. Flavor was a distant fifth priority, asterisk somewhere between won't explode if dropped and doesn't attract rats. Different nations approach the problem in different ways. The Americans tried to science their way to sustenance, producing little boxes of optimism called creations. The Germans early in the war sent troops out with hearty meat and rye. Then, eventually replaced it all with something resembling punishment in a can. The British clung to tea like it was holding the empire together. It probably was. The Soviets boiled cabbage asterisk like it was a sacred tradition. And the Japanese, well, they were expected to travel light and fight hard, sometimes on just rice balls and hope. Food wasn't just fuel, it was morale. A hot meal could lift spirits. A cold tin of greasy corned beef could crush them. Some soldiers developed fondness for their rations. Others swore they'd never eat a cracker again. Many dreamed not of glory or victory, but of butter, bread, and anything that didn't come wrapped in brown paper. And while generals debated asterisk strategy in war rooms, privates in foxholes were bartering chocolate for cigarettes and praying the guy next to them didn't snore through mess call. So tonight, we're not talking about battles won or borders redrawn. We're talking about Spam, crackers, powdered eggs, and the real war between soldiers and the strange, suspicious contents of their ration tins. Because if there's one universal truth about war, it's that everyone has to eat, even if the food fights back. Alright, you're a US soldier in asterisk World War II. You've marched 10 miles, been shot at 6 times, and haven't seen a flush toilet in weeks. Your stomach is making sounds that could qualify as artillery. What do you get? The Creation. A compact, calorie-packed cardboard miracle designed by people who clearly hadn't eaten one themselves. Let's break it down. The Creation came in 3 boxes: breakfast, lunch, and dinner. They were about the size of a small brick, and sometimes felt like one. Each box contained just enough food to asterisk technically qualify as nutrition while emotionally preparing you for combat via culinary disappointment. Breakfast kicked off strong. A can of ham and eggs, which was neither hammy nor eggy. The texture, think Spam meets drywall. Toss in rock-hard crackers, instant coffee, powdered lemonade. Why? A couple of sticks of gum for cigarettes. Because nothing says balanced breakfast like a Marlboro. And best of all, one single sheet of toilet paper. Just one. Make it count. Lunch was not better. You might asterisk get cheese spread with more chemicals than cheese. Another stack of jaw-shattering biscuits, and a chocolate bar so dense it could double as tank armor. no spoon, no problem. You'd use your knife, a stick, or blind rage to scoop it out. Dinner was meat and beans, which looked like a crime scene in a can. With it, more crackers, more gum, and sometimes, if you prayed hard, a tiny fruit bar which tasted like someone whispered the word apple over a piece of wood. Despite their taste, creations were asterisk nutritional marvels. Roughly 3,000 calories a day, packed with protein, fat, sugar, and just enough flavor to ensure you didn't accidentally enjoy it. Troops often swapped components like prison traders. Cigarettes for chocolate, cheese for crackers, anything to dodge the ham trauma. But every now and then, you'd find a Hershey bar. Real chocolate, real comfort. For one bite, you weren't in the mud, you were back home. That alone made the rest of the ration worth tolerating. So yes, the asterisk creation was dry, weirdly square, and kind of tasted like war. But in the end, it was the fuel that helped win a global conflict, one questionable meat product at a time. If the creation was the Army's idea of a meal, then the deration was their idea of a survival threat disguised as dessert. The deration looked like a chocolate bar, came wrapped like a chocolate bar, and was issued to soldiers as a chocolate bar. But that's where the similarities ended, because this wasn't your sweet little Hershey's Kiss. No. Asterisk the D-ration was engineered in coordination with the U.S. Army to do three things. 1. Not melt. 2. Last forever. And 3. Taste like absolute despair. It was roughly the size of a deck of cards and dense enough to stop a bullet. In fact, some soldiers swore it had weather in their packs or their intestines. The ingredients were technically food, chocolate, sugar, oat flour, and a little cocoa fat. The result, a brown brick that could double as a bludgeon or emergency building material. Why was it made this way? Asterisk, because it had to survive the tropics, deserts, and frozen tundras without turning into goo. And the military specifically requested it be unappetizing, so soldiers wouldn't eat it unless they were actually starving. Mission accomplished. The bar was so hard that biting into it without softening at first could lead to dental emergencies. Some guys tried grating it into hot water. Others just stared at it in confusion. A few, legend says, used it to hammer tent stakes. But hey, it had calories, about 600 per bar, which could asterisk keep a man alive through a day of combat. Barely. If you were trapped behind enemy lines or stuck in a foxhole with nothing but your rifle and bad decisions, the D-ration might just save your life. Emotionally, not so much. To the Army's credit, they did eventually realize feeding troops chocolate that doubled as masonry was not great for morale. Later iterations of the D-ration got slightly softer and vaguely more edible, but the damage was done. Soldiers remembered the original bar with the same fondness one asterisk remembers dental surgery. So next time you hear someone say, chocolate makes everything better, remember the D-ration, the bar that proved them wrong. If the C-ration was survival food and the D-ration was edible punishment, then the field kitchen was a soldier's only shot at eating something warm, recognizable, and only mildly soul-crushing. Field kitchens, also known as rolling misery carts, were mobile food units pulled behind trucks or horses. They were the military's attempt at fine asterisk dining on the go. And by fine, we mean not cold and in a can. These kitchens churned out industrial-sized vats of stew, beans, grave-like substances, and enough coffee to power an infantry division through a mild existential crisis. Meals were served cafeteria style. You'd line up with your trusty mess kit, a metal tray that looked like it belonged in a science experiment, and shuffle forward. Praying the guy ahead didn't take the last ladle of something vaguely meat-cold. The food was ladled out with military asterisk precision. One scoop for you, one suspicious stare, and on to the next, private. The menu, it depended on where you were. In Europe, you might get creamed chipped beef on toast. affectionately and permanently renamed by the troops as SOS or stuff on a shingle, though most used a less polite sword. In the Pacific, you were lucky if it wasn't just rice and hot dog fragments swimming in broth. Coffee, though, was sacred. It was strong, bitter, and brewed in quantities large enough to reanimate the dead. Soldiers drank it hot, cold, black, or with powdered milk, as long as it kept them awake and angry. The best part of the field kitchen experience: the smell. It meant food was coming. The worst part? Everything else. Your food was served outdoors, often in rain, snow, or the kind of mud that had its own ecosystem. You sat on rocks, helmets, or the ground. There were no forks. There was no ambiance. Just you, your friends, and a tin of beans that might be older than your commanding officer. Still, when it was hot and vaguely chewable, field kitchen food felt like heaven. It wasn't glamorous, but in a world of chaos, bullets, and creations, it was the closest thing to comfort food. At the start of World War II, German soldiers marched into battle with swagger, clean uniforms, and something shockingly rare in wartime logistics: actual food that resembled real meals. The early war Wehrmacht ration was downright luxurious compared to what most other armies were choking down. The standard soldier's pack included rye bread, sausages, butter, cheese, canned meats, marmalade, and coffee. That's coffee, which we'll discuss later with the disgust it deserves. Each soldier was expected to carry his own food for a couple of days. A noble idea until you realized how much weight that was once you added rifles, ammunition, grenades, and frostbite. Still, German rations were built around the concept of 3 hot meals a day, with field kitchens trailing behind like slightly overworked food trucks. Breakfast could be dark rye bread with jam or butter, plus that roasted acorn faux coffee. Lunch, tinned meat, cheese, and maybe a boiled potato or 3. Dinner, if you were lucky and not actively being shelled, might be soup or stew made from whatever was still moving that morning. Sausage, especially Metwurst and Leber, was a staple. It was easy to transport, packed with protein, and vaguely comforting. Also incredibly smelly in a sealed tin, which made every trench a blend of iron, sweat, and spicy pork aroma. And of course, Germans had bread. Good bread, real bread. Soldiers often reminisced more about losing access to proper bread than about losing a warm bed. One Wehrmacht veteran described ration bread as the only softness in an otherwise very sharp war. Field kitchens backed this system up, churning out steaming pots of stews, boiled meats, and dumplings when possible. Morale was high, stomachs were relatively full, and German efficiency seemed unstoppable. But, and there's always a but, this early golden age of German rations wouldn't last. As the war expanded and supply lines stretched thin, the sausage turned sour, the bread got stale, and the once proud field kitchens were left stranded in frozen forests with nothing but frozen potatoes and patriotic memories. Still, for a brief, brat-filled moment, the average German soldier had something precious in war: warm food, decent coffee, substitutes, and the illusion that this whole thing might be over by Christmas. As World War II dragged on and Hitler's dream, a blitzkrieg glory turned into a logistical nightmare. German rations took a sharp turn. Straight into the land of Satz, a German word that basically means imitation. Or more accurately, this isn't food, but we're calling it that anyway. By 1942, things were getting creative. Real coffee, gone. In came a Satz Cafe, a charming blend of roasted acorns, cory, sugar beet, or barley. It smelled like despair and tasted like something brewed in an old boot. It technically resembled coffee if you'd never had coffee before and were very forgiving. Bread, once dark, hearty, and soul-sustaining, it was now packed with fillers. Sawdust, straw flour, potato starch, and whatever else they could legally grind into powder. You might still call it bread, but your teeth would disagree. Some soldiers joked it doubled as helmet padding. Butter disappeared too, replaced by Zotz margarine, a pale, tasteless grease that was somehow both oily and chalky. Meat became a memory. Cans of meat products started showing up. Labels asterisk didn't specify the animal, and honestly, it was better not to ask. Even sausages, that sacred pillar of German cuisine, were diluted. Horse meat entered the mix. Then turnip. Filler. Eventually, some sausages were up to 40% plant material. Imagine biting into a bratwurst and getting a mouthful of damp newspaper. Welcome to the Reich's culinary downfall. The problem wasn't just taste. These Zatz rations lacked nutrients, calories, and morale. Troops in the East were burning thousands of asterisk calories in sub-zero, either in getting food that couldn't even sustain a dachshund. Starvation, sickness, and desperation followed. Soldiers got inventive, boiling shoe leather, bartering with locals, or raiding enemy supply lines just to get something real. A single American chocolate bar was worth more than a stack of Wehrmacht bread. What had begun as an efficient fuel-powered war machine was now being run on cabbage water and caffeine lies. The Germans had started with real food. Now they were chewing misery and asterisk washing it down with roasted roots. If there was a place where food went to die during World War II, it was the Eastern Front, stretching thousands of miles from Berlin. To the deep frozen belly of Russia, the Eastern Front was the logistical equivalent of trying to run a pizza delivery service across a glacier while being shot at, shelled, and occasionally eaten by wolves. German soldiers who once feasted on sausage and rye found themselves crouched in snowdrifts with frozen fingers and empty stomachs. Rations asterisk shrank, supply lines collapsed, and morale thawed faster than the soup. Which is to say, not at all. Let's talk about that soup. Meal on the Eastern Front often meant hot water with a few potato peels if you were lucky. If you weren't, it was just water, frozen solid by the time it got to you. Bread. It arrived, moldy, or not at all. Meat. Rumor only. Soldiers burned precious. Firewood, not to warm themselves, but to thaw their canned meat products, which might have been beef, pork, or recycled optimism. Asterisk and God help you if the label had worn off. You'd have to sniff your way through the mystery. In winter, men boiled snow for drinking water, heated tins over engine blocks, and sometimes ate snow out of desperation, which sounds harmless until you realize it lowers your core body temperature and brings you one step closer to freezing to death with a mouthful of slush. Then there were the rats, bold, fat, and suspiciously well-fed. Some units resorted to catching and cooking them. Others considered the rats rivals, stealing asterisk scraps from each other in midnight battles that historians mercifully don't teach in classrooms. Desperation also led to bartering. Soldiers traded cigarettes for bread, buttons for sugar, or a pair of socks for half a boiled potato. A single spoonful of jam could start a fight. If you had chocolate, you were a god. Despite the hunger, the cold, and the lack of anything resembling a balanced meal, soldiers endured. They joked, swore, and ate whatever they could scourge. But every mealtime became asterisk a grim ritual. Unwrap the tin, say a silent prayer, and hope it didn't bite back. On the Eastern Front, food wasn't just scarce. It was a cruel game of survival, played one frozen spoonful at a time. If German troops on the Eastern Front were eating misery, Soviet soldiers were chewing on sheer willpower. The Red Army's approach to nutrition was simple. If it filled a stomach and didn't kill you immediately, it was dinner. The official rations, black bread, cabbage soup, buckwheat asterisk, porridge, kasher, a few boiled potatoes, maybe dried fish, and the ever-reliable unsweetened tea. In winter, that tea was usually melted snow with a twig in it. Meat was listed on paper. Yes, in reality, rare as a warm bath in Stalingrad. When meat did arrive, it was often salted to the point that chewing it was more of a jaw exercise than a meal. Still, it was considered a luxury. Soldiers licked the fat off old meat tins just to savor the memory. And then there was the bread, a staple of every Soviet meal. It was coarse, black, and asterisk, made from whatever grain was still legal to eat. It was also strictly rationed. A typical serving could fit in your palm and be gone in 2 bites. If you didn't try to save it by licking it slowly like a sad war lollipop. Cabbage was the hero of Soviet cuisine. Soup, stew, stuffed, shredded, or fermented. If there was a pot, there was cabbage in it. So much cabbage, in fact, that some Soviet soldiers joked they smelled it in their sleep and dreamed of becoming turnips just to escape the cycle. Still hungry? Castrus good. Now you understand the Soviet wartime diet. Soldiers routinely went into combat, underfed and overexerted. Rations were supposed to be delivered daily, but in war-torn zones that became when possible, which often meant never. So they improvised. Foraging became a way of life. Soldiers dug up frozen potatoes from abandoned farms, shot wild animals when they could, and bartered cigarettes or spare boots for a boiled egg. Occasionally, they even traded with German PS, food for silence. The miracle. They endured, malnourished, exhausted, but relentless. Soviet troops pressed forward on fumes and boiled cabbage, proving that sometimes what feeds a soldier isn't calories, it's pure cabbage-fueled stubbornness. When official rations ran dry, which was often, Soviet soldiers didn't starve quietly. They adapted loudly. With creativity, desperation, and occasionally the culinary sensibilities of a raccoon. Red Army troops turned battlefield improvisation into an extreme sport. Let's say you're a soldier outside Leningrad. You haven't seen a delivery truck in a week. Your cabbage soup is now just water with a floating leaf, and your last piece of black bread has grown a beard. What do? Option 1. Forage. Soldiers scoured the countryside for anything remotely edible. Berries, tree bark, boiled grass, dandelions, even flower bulbs. One particularly resourceful unit figured out how to roast shoe leather. Not because it tasted good, it didn't, but because it was technically organic. Option 2. Barter. A spare pair of socks might earn you a potato, a broken watch, maybe a spoonful of lard. Tobacco was currency, soap was gold. And if you had a tin of meat, you could get someone to write a letter home and clean your rifle. Option 3. Theft, or as they called it, unauthorized logistics. Soviet soldiers occasionally raided abandoned German outposts just for food. One Red Army veteran recalled the sheer euphoria of finding a box of Wehrmacht sausages. The first time I cried and salivated. At the same time, field kitchens, when functional, were masters of mystery cooking. Cooks tossed in whatever they had. Beets, onions, mystery meat, pickled vegetables from 1913. The resulting soup was red, hot, and suspiciously chewy, but it kept you going mostly. And yet, morale didn't collapse. Why? Because Soviet culture glorified suffering as proof of strength. Soldiers turned deprivation into a badge of honor. They told jokes about their rations. They sang songs about dried fish. They gave names to their tin cups, which was either camaraderie or a mild fever dream. In the Red Army, mealtime wasn't about flavor. It was about survival theater. Every bowl of borscht, every crumb of bread was a statement. We're still here. If World War II were judged solely by culinary performance, the British Army might have been forced to surrender to its own menu. British soldiers didn't eat. They endured. Their rations were a war within the war. A daily ritual of unseasoned punishment washed down with eternal optimism and as much tea as humanly possible. Let's start with the sacred trinity. tea hardtack biscuits, and bully beef. Tea was everything more than a drink. It was morale in liquid form. Soldiers brewed it in tin mugs, mess tins, helmets, anything that held heat and didn't leak too much. Sometimes there was no milk, no sugar, no dignity, just hot brown water and hope, but it got them through. Hardtack biscuits were designed to outlive the soldier. Dense, chalky, and almost completely tasteless, they had the structural integrity of roofing tiles. They doubled as plates, coasters, asterisk, or makeshift armor in a pinch. Many troops claimed their dental issues weren't from combat, but from trying to bite these biscuits. Then came bully beef, aka tinned corned beef. It had the visual appeal of canned cat food and the consistency of congealed regret. It was salty, oily, and could be eaten hot, cold, or with the appropriate level of emotional numbness. You sliced it, fried it, diced it, or just stared at it until your appetite left the tent. Also included in the standard ration, powdered eggs, which asterisk somehow tasted nothing like eggs. Tinned jam, which could glue your jaw shut. And a smattering of oatmeal, chocolate, and dried fruits, all of which arrived in tins that took a crowbar and a prayer to open. The British Army didn't pretend its food was good. It pretended it was sufficient, and in fairness, it kept soldiers alive, barely. Field kitchens could sometimes provide stews, stewed prunes, and the occasional surprise. A real egg, a slice of bread, or something not immediately depressing. But, no matter the food, asterisk, there was always tea. Shells could fall, trucks could explode. But if there was hot water, there was a brew. And in that mug, steaming in a muddy trench, was Britain's greatest ration of all, stubbornness in a cup. By mid, British soldiers weren't just fighting the Axis. They were fighting ration fatigue, an invisible enemy that came disguised as another tin of corned beef. The British military supply system was held together with string, hope, and a suspicious number of forms in triplicate. Fighting asterisk across multiple continents, from North Africa to Italy to the jungles of Burma, meant rations got weirder the farther you were from London, and colder and often squishier. A ration in Cairo might arrive slightly warm and edible. A ration. In the Burmese jungle, it might arrive moldy, half-eaten by ants, and 2 weeks late. And still, soldiers saluted it, heated it, and ate it. Because that's what British resilience looked like. Chewing quietly through despair. Water was always boiled. Not just to kill bacteria, but because asterisk boiling meant tea. Tea was sacred. Men would risk sniper fire to retrieve a kettle. A warm cup could make the difference between a breakdown and a moment of British dignity in the mud. When supplies were tight, and they often were, soldiers got creative. Bladed. Powdered milk into tea whitener, spread jam on hardtack with bayonets, and seasoned meat with sarcasm. One soldier reportedly made a stew out of bully beef, raisins, and crushed vitamin tablets. The result, morally questionable, but technically asterisk food. Tinned food was both a blessing and a curse. It lasted forever, yes, but it also required strength, tools, and sometimes divine intervention to open. Soldiers developed strong opinions about tin designs and spent entire afternoons discussing the good key roll ones versus those devil tins with no handles. When something fresh did show up, an egg, a loaf of bread, an actual vegetable, it was cause for celebration or suspicion. One soldier, upon receiving a fresh tomato, stared at it for an hour before asterisk deciding to keep it as a pet. Despite the rationing, the blandness, and the biscuitinous jaw pain, British troops remained stoic. They grumbled with dignity, made jokes about their own digestion, and above all, kept calm and carried on, preferably with tea. If the American soldier had rations, the German had organization, and the Brit had tea, the Japanese soldier had rice, and a terrifying capacity for suffering. The Imperial Japanese Army was built on endurance. Soldiers were taught that self-denial was noble, and that hunger asterisk was part of their duty. Which was convenient because most of them were perpetually starving. The standard Japanese field ration wasn't so much a meal as it was a polite suggestion. The typical pack contained white rice, barley, dried fish, pickled plums, umeboshi, soy sauce concentrate, and maybe a few hard candies. It was compact, culturally, familiar, and in the field, utterly insufficient. At first, troops set out with multi-day rations wrapped in wax paper or stored in bento-style metal tins. It looked neat, organized, thought asterisk out. And then they got to the jungle. In places like New Guinea, Burma, and Guadalcanal, the humidity turned rice into moldy goo. Rats ate through supplies, and fish went bad faster than your hopes of victory. To make matters worse, Japan's military logistics were, generously speaking, a disaster. Supply lines were stretched, bombed, blocked, or forgot to exist. Altogether, many units went days, even weeks, with barely a handful of rice to split between them. Soldiers foraged, raided villages, or ate jungle plants, asterisk, whose nutritional value ranged from slightly helpful to hallucinate, then collapse. In more desperate cases, they hunted lizards, insects, or even rats. One soldier claimed they made a soup out of boiled grass and boot leather to keep the stomach from shouting. To their credit, or perhaps horror, Japanese troops rarely complained. They believed hardship was honorable. Starving, glorious, barefoot, inspirational, rice infested with weevils, added protein. There was occasionally miso paste or powdered green tea. These were prized asterisk and hoarded like wartime treasure. A teaspoon of tea could lift spirits. A pinch of salt could bring someone to tears. But overall, calories were low, suffering was high, and morale often came from sheer cultural discipline rather than what passed for a meal. The Japanese soldier wasn't just underfed, he was trained to be okay with it. And somehow, many of them kept fighting. Not because of what was in their bellies, but because of what was in their minds. The jungles of the Pacific looked lush and green in the asterisk distance. Like a tropical paradise, assuming you ignored the disease, the leeches, and the smell of slow death. But for soldiers on both sides, especially the Japanese, the jungle wasn't a source of food. It was a leafy green death trap with humidity and attitude. Supply lines in the Pacific were notoriously unstable. Tropical storms, naval blockades, enemy ambushes all conspired to make every delivery of rice, beans, or saltfish an act of divine luck. And when the food didn't come, the jungle was not your friend. Asterisk, many Japanese units found themselves cut off from resupply for weeks. Soldiers had to rely on the land, which would have been fine if the land had any idea what they were doing. Unfortunately, the jungle was filled with plants that looked edible but weren't, animals that were edible but too fast, and insects that were not only inedible but actively aggressive. Rations spoiled in hours. Canned goods rusted shut. Rice grew mold faster than you could light a fire. One soldier in Guadalcanal wrote, asterisk, everything here is wet. Even my appetite is damp. What did they eat when lucky? Boiled roots, wild fruit, frogs, or jungle fowl. If they could catch it, when unlucky, tree bark, shoe leather, rotting palm stems, or water flavored with desperation. Stories exist of soldiers boiling the same handful of rice 3 times to extract every last shred of sustenance. Others fermented what was left into a starchy, half-dead porridge known only as jungle glue. And then there were the horrifying rumors. Accounts of cannibalism among starving units, especially during sieges. It wasn't widespread, but it did happen. Men driven to the edge by war, isolation, and the shrieking emptiness of their stomachs. If anything can strip away the romanticism of the Pacific theater, it's that grim little footnote. Disease followed closely behind starvation. Malaria, dysentery, Dengue fever, all worsened by malnutrition. Soldiers dropped not from bullets, but from hunger and infection, slowly and invisibly. The jungle didn't care who asterisk you fought for. It didn't feed you. It didn't shelter you. It just waited for you to get tired, and then it ate you. War may destroy cities, but it also unlocks the culinary creativity of very hungry, very desperate people with bayonets and a single can of Spam. Across every front, soldiers didn't just eat rations. They negotiated with them. They bartered, swapped, stretched, crushed, fried, and sometimes worshipped the better parts. Food was fuel, but it was also a form of entertainment and occasionally a mad science experiment. In American foxholes, GIs turned Creation crackers into improvised pancakes, mixing them with powdered eggs and coffee creamer, then frying the result over a small fire. The final product tasted like despair, but warm despair, which was at least comforting. Canned cheese melted into an oily paste over hot beans to create trench fondue. Spam sliced, pan-fried, and stacked between biscuits to make the world's saddest sandwich. Even chewing gum found new uses, sealing leaky asterisk cantons or bribing a guy with an extra cigarette. British soldiers armed with their indestructible heart attack and mystical jars of jam-made jam. Buddy sandwiches by smashing 2 biscuits together with jam until their teeth gave up. One squad in North Africa famously mixed bully beef with dried fruit and called it dessert delight. Another named their nightly stew stuff because no one could identify what was in it anymore, including the cook. On the Eastern Front, Soviet soldiers used empty shell asterisk casings as soup pots, boiled cabbage in helmets, and roasted anything with legs, including once a stolen German sausage that required 3 men to defend it. Even the Japanese, with limited supplies, found ways to repurpose leftovers. Rice was refried with pickled vegetables to create anaji-style cakes. Dried seaweed was hoarded for flavoring water when nothing else remained. These weren't gourmet meals. They were acts of wartime alchemy. Field improvisation turned boredom into morale, turned not enough asterisk into this will do, and made a lot of food slightly less terrifying. Because when you're stuck in a trench, jungle, or ruined farmhouse, your mess kit becomes your kitchen. Your bayonet becomes a spatula. And your meal a miracle that you survived long enough to eat it. Long after the guns fell silent. Long after uniforms were packed away and medals boxed in. Drawers, one thing stayed with veterans of World War II. The food, or more precisely, the memory of the food. For many soldiers, rations asterisk were more than just sustenance. They were the backdrop to trauma, camaraderie, grief, boredom, and hope. A bite of bully beef could conjure a foxhole in France. A whiff of cabbage soup brought back the frozen trenches outside Stalingrad. A can of Spam wasn't just meat. It was a moment in time. Some remembered their meals with dark humor. American vets would joke about choking down a D ration like it owed them money. British troops swapped stories of trying to trade hardtack biscuits with locals asterisk only to be laughed at. One Soviet veteran claimed he couldn't eat bread for years after the war, not because he hated it, but because it felt like sacred ground. Food marked the boundaries of war. A fresh apple meant you were near a farm and maybe peace. A hot stew from a field kitchen meant you weren't dying that day. Even bad coffee meant someone cared enough to boil water. Then there were the care packages, those precious morale-boosting gifts from home. Chocolate bars, dried fruit, powdered asterisk milk, handwritten notes tucked beside cookies. These weren't just treats. They were emotional lifelines. Some soldiers hoarded them. Others shared them. A few rationed them out, one bite at a time, stretching hope across weeks of horror. And yet, some flavors stuck around too long. Veterans joked that they could still taste the metal of the tin decades later. One GI swore he could still smell Spam every time it rained. Another insisted his nightmares occasionally starred powdered eggs. Because when you eat an asterisk war, you're not just feeding your body, you're anchoring your existence. You're trying to stay human in a world gone mad. And that means every meal, however bland or bizarre, becomes part of you. So next time you toss a snack in the microwave, think of those soldiers cooking with firewood, bayonets, and sheer determination. For them, every bite was survival, and the taste, it never really left. The ink was barely dry on the U.S. Constitution when the young republic found itself brewing its first major asterisk crisis, one that came not from foreign invaders or political factions, but from something far more potent: whiskey. In the early 1790s, America was broke. The Revolutionary War had left the nation buried in debt, and the new federal government, led by President George Washington and Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton, needed a plan. Hamilton, ever the fiscal mastermind, proposed an excise tax on domestically produced distilled spirits, whiskey being the most common. To the urban elites and coastal merchants, it sounded asterisk reasonable. But on the western frontier, it sounded like a punch in the face from a powdered Whig aristocrat. Out west, in places like western Pennsylvania, whiskey wasn't just a drink, it was currency. Farmers distilled their surplus grain into whiskey because it was easier to transport, less perishable, and far more profitable than raw crops. Bartering whiskey for goods and services was part of daily life. So when the federal government started taxing it, many frontier folks saw it not as a revenue measure, but as an asterisk betrayal. A reminder that power was drifting back to the same kind of distant authority they'd just fought a revolution to escape. To make matters worse, the tax structure itself seemed custom-allowed to screw over small producers. Large distilleries could pay an annual flat fee, but small-time distillers, like the ones populating the Appalachian Hills, had to pay per gallon. Translation: the little guy paid more proportionally. And with federal tax collectors showing up on horseback to enforce the new law, tensions began to asterisk boil over. At first, the resistance was petty. Inspectors were threatened, tax documents were burned, and revenue officers were politely told to get lost. But soon, polite turned to violent. Tar and featherings made a comeback. Taxmen were chased from their homes. In one case, a revenue officer was stripped naked, tied to a tree, and had his hair cut off. Frontier justice with a splash of moonshine fueled rage. And Washington. He was watching silently, waiting, but not for long. Because what started as a tax protest asterisk was about to spiral into an armed uprising. It's one that would test the strength of the Constitution and Washington's resolve to enforce it. By 1792, the whiskey tax wasn't just unpopular, it was radioactive. In the backwoods communities of Pennsylvania, Kentucky, and Virginia, opposition was mutating from scattered grumblings into coordinated defiance. Tax collectors were becoming familiar with two sounds: the clink of broken windows and the snap of gunfire overhead. The western counties of asterisk Pennsylvania became the epicenter of what many began to call outright rebellion. Meetings were held in taverns and cabins where kegs of homemade whiskey stood proudly next to musketses. These weren't just drunken gripes, they were organized gatherings. Locals formed militias, issued threats to federal officials, and even passed their own resolutions condemning the tax. Some refused to do business with anyone who paid it. It was part protest, part mafia, with a side of corn liquor. In 1793, things escalated further. Tax asterisk collectors and sympathizers were ambushed, whipped, and humiliated. One man was captured and paraded through town with a sign reading "Coward" hung around his neck. It was like the Boston Tea Party, but drunker and with worse hygiene. The federal courts responded by issuing summons to bring the rebels to justice. But good luck serving legal papers in a place where the local sheriff might be part of the mob. The region was effectively slipping into lawlessness. Local officials either turned a blind eye or quietly sided with the insurgents. President Washington, usually calm and measured, started gritting his false teeth. The Whiskey Rebellion was threatening not only public order, but also the legitimacy of federal law itself. If the government couldn't enforce its own taxes, then what was the point of a constitution? What was the point of government? Still, Washington didn't rush. He sent federal commissioners to negotiate with the rebels. But it was like trying to serve tea at a bar fight. The rebels had already formed committees, held conventions, and in some cases talked about full-on secession. They saw themselves not as criminals, but as patriots standing up to tyranny. Meanwhile, Hamilton, ever the hawk, was whispering in Washington's ear. "You want to let these guys stomp on the Constitution? Really? After everything we just went through?" And so Washington made a decision, one that would shock the rebels and set a historic precedent. He would raise a federal army against his own people. By 1794, the Whiskey Rebellion had become more than a backwards tantrum. It was an outright challenge to federal authority. George Washington, who had led a revolution just a decade prior, now found himself in the bizarre position of leading an army against Americans, the very citizens he helped liberate. And this wasn't some ragtag militia. Washington called upon more than 12,000 troops, nearly 3 times the size of the force he had at the Battle of Trenton. That included state militias from Maryland, New Jersey, Virginia, and Pennsylvania. Many of these troops were volunteers, but others were voluntold. It was the largest federal force ever marshaled in the U.S. to that point, and it wasn't going to war with the British or French. It was marching west to put down angry farmers with pitchforks and moonshine stills. Hamilton, never want to miss a dramatic moment, rode out with the army like some powdered wig version of Patton. He was thrilled. This was his big moment to show that the federal government had teeth and wasn't afraid to bite. Washington, though reluctant, knew the stakes. The rebellion wasn't just about booze. It was about whether the United States could function as a nation under law. If the rebels could scare off tax collectors and defy Congress without consequences, then the Constitution might as well be used for kindling. So for the first and only time in American history, a sitting president led troops in the field. Imagine the scene. The most famous man in America, a strider horse riding westward through the Allegheny Mountains. Not to inspire revolution, but to crush one. His presence sent a chilling message. Rebellion would be met not with pamphlets, but with bayonets. When the army approached the heart of rebel territory in western Pennsylvania, the response was disappointing. The rebels, who had talked big in taverns and torched a few tacksmen's houses, suddenly remembered they had chores to do. Most of the ringleaders vanished. Others fled into the woods or took the, nothing about nothing defense. There would be no great battle, no climactic showdown. The army had marched hundreds of miles to confront a rebellion that fizzled like flat cider. But Washington's message was loud and clear. The federal government was no joke. With a rebellion smothered before a single shot was fired in return, the soldiers turned around and headed home. And so did George Washington. But now came the mop. Arrests, trials, and justice, federal style. A handful of rebel leaders were captured. Though leaders might be generous, many of the more radical agitators had slipped away into the wilderness. What remained were a few unlucky men who got caught by bad timing or bad hiding spots. 20 were eventually brought to Philadelphia to stand trial for treason. The trials, however, didn't unfold like Hamilton might have dreamed. Evidence was spotty. Witnesses were afraid to testify, and the jury, composed of their fellow Pennians, wasn't exactly keen on throwing their neighbors into a Neustadt in the end. Only 2 men were convicted of treason, and even that verdict came with a side of skepticism. These weren't dangerous warlords. They were poor farmers who had made poor decisions, and Washington, no stranger to rebellion himself, chose mercy over vengeance. In a move that stunned some and reassured others, he pardoned both men. His message: yes, the government would enforce the law, but it would not become a tyrant in the process. This act of clemency turned out to be as important as the show of force itself. Washington had demonstrated strength, but he also showed restraint. The federal government wasn't going to crush people under its heel like a monarchy might have. Instead, it would lead by law, tempered with justice. Meanwhile, Hamilton grumbled. He wanted more heads to roll, metaphorically, if not literally. He saw the rebellion as proof that the common folk couldn't be trusted with too much freedom, especially not with whiskey involved. But Washington understood the deeper game. Legitimacy didn't come from cracking skulls. It came from showing that the new republic could balance authority with compassion. The rebellion was over, but the precedent it set would echo for generations. The U.S. had passed its first real test of federal authority, and it didn't collapse into chaos. Still, questions remained. Would future presidents use the same logic? Would mercy always follow power? And most of all, was this the end of frontier rebellion, or just the beginning? The guns were holstered, the asterisk rebels pardoned, and the whiskey stills quietly resumed, bubbling in the hills. But politically, the Whiskey Rebellion left a hangover that would last for years. The event had proven that the federal government had the power to enforce its laws. But it also lit the fuse on deep political divisions that were already smoldering beneath the surface. At the heart of the conflict were 2 opposing visions of America. On one side stood Alexander Hamilton and the Federalists, lovers of order, commerce, strong central government, and powdered Whigs that could stop a bullet. They saw the rebellion as proof that the unruly countryside needed firm management. On the other side were the Jeffersonian Republicans who didn't trust centralized power one bit. They believed in the Iman farmer, local control, and resisting. The kind of government overreach they'd fought a revolution to escape. To them, the federal response to the Whiskey Rebellion wasn't a heroic act of law enforcement. It was overkill, sending 12,000 troops after some farmers with barrels of corn. MASH felt like stomping on a fly with a cannon. Thomas Jefferson, then serving as Washington's vice president, didn't hold back his opinions. Privately, he referred to the federal march as a monarchical adventure. He believed that Washington's show of force only pushed the common man further away from the government and straight into the arms of the Republican cause. And indeed, in the aftermath of the rebellion, something curious happened. A typically Republican party began to gain traction. Out on the frontier, where distrust of federal authority had been fermented like whiskey itself, support for Jefferson's ideals surged. These weren't just drunk and angry farmers anymore. They were voters. And they were angry about being treated like a bunch of criminals for refusing a tax they could barely afford. The rebellion had failed militarily, but it succeeded in galvanizing anti-federalist sentiment. It helped accelerate the formation of the first true political parties in America, sharpening the divide between those who wanted a strong, centralized state and those who wanted the states to call their own shots. So while no war had broken out, a new kind of battle had begun. One fought not with muskets and torches, but with ballots, speeches, and ideology. At its core, the Whiskey Rebellion wasn't just about booze. It was about power and class resentment. To the small farmers of western Pennsylvania and beyond, the whiskey tax was more than an annoying expense. It was a symbol of everything they feared about the new federal government, that it would be run by elites for elites at the expense of the working poor. Most of the rebellion's participants weren't outlaws. They were veterans of the Revolutionary War. men who had fought and bled for a republic. They now felt was turning its back on them. They returned from battlefields to discover that the very government they helped establish was now squeezing them dry, all while cozying up to Eastern bankers and merchants. It was like Asterisk fighting a lion, only to come home and get kicked by the house cat. To make matters worse, many frontier folk felt deliberately excluded from political participation. Representation was lopsided. Their voices were drowned out by wealthier urban politicians who had no idea what life was like west of the Appalachians. Add to that a tax that disproportionately punished small producers, and the whole thing smelled less like economic policy and more like class warfare with the stink of whiskey. There was also the matter of Asterisk how the law was enforced. Wealthier distillers could afford lawyers, paperwork, and the annual flat fee. The poor guy with 1 still and 6 barrels of mash, he got a federal marshal and a potential prison sentence. The optics were terrible and the anger was real. In this way, the rebellion was an early warning sign. Class tension wasn't going to disappear just because America had a constitution. If anything, the struggle between wealthy power centers and rural working communities was baked into the Asterisk cake. The Whiskey Rebellion was just the first slice. Interestingly, some of the most radical rebels even adopted the language of the French Revolution, which was happening around the same time. They spoke of liberty, tyranny, and the rights of man. To Washington and Hamilton, that kind of rhetoric was terrifying. The last thing they wanted was a peristyle bloodbath spilling into the Ohio Valley. But to the whiskey rebels, those words weren't dangerous. They were a promise, one they felt had Asterisk already been broken. George Washington's decision to personally lead troops into western Pennsylvania was as bold as it was risky. At the time, many Americans saw the presidency as a somewhat distant, almost ceremonial role, a sort of executive moderator for a government still figuring itself out. But with this march, Washington shattered that image. He was no passive figurehead. He was an active enforcer of federal power. For Washington, the Whiskey Rebellion was a test not just of law and order, but of Asterisk, the very legitimacy of the federal system. He had helped design the Constitution, and now he was putting it to work. If he failed, if he allowed violence and intimidation to override legislation, the whole project might unravel. 13 separate states could quickly decide they were better, off going their own way. The rebellion in that light wasn't just a backwards tantrum. It was the canary in the Democratic coal mine. Washington's personal involvement added enormous weight. His reputation was nearly mythical. He was the father of his country, a man revered by veterans, respected by citizens, and feared by enemies. When word spread that Washington himself was riding west, many rebels melted into the landscape. Some couldn't believe it. Washington was the hero of liberty. Now he was marching on citizens over whiskey. But the gamble paid off. Washington didn't need to fire a single shot to win. His presence alone restored order, and he knew when to stop. Once the rebellion dissolved, he Asterisk withdrew. He didn't occupy. The region didn't punish the masses, didn't turn it into a show trial. He just reminded everyone firmly that the law was not optional. Yet not everyone applauded. Some, especially in the Jeffersonian camp, accused Washington of using military force to silence legitimate political dissent. They painted the march as an overreaction, a flex of executive muscle that could have turned ugly fast. Even some Federalists worried. What precedent had just been set? Still, the Asterisk Rebellion's swift collapse allowed Washington to exit the presidency on a high note. He had enforced the law without becoming a tyrant. He had shown strength without cruelty. But quietly, Washington understood this wouldn't be the last time America's unity would be tested, and next time the outcome might not be so bloodless. Although the Whiskey Rebellion ended with barely a whimper, Its echoes rippled far and wide politically, legally, and culturally. In hindsight, this dusty conflict over distilled grain was one of the most important constitutional stress tests. In U.S. history, first, it set a critical precedent. The federal government had the right and the ability to enforce its laws even in the face of violent opposition. Before this, the Constitution had been more theory than reality. The Articles of Confederation had shown how weak and toothless a decentralized government could be. And now the Constitution, with Washington's boots on the ground, flexed its newfound muscles. But with that power came a lingering fear. Many Americans, especially in rural areas, began to see the federal government not as a representative of their will, but as a distant Eastern elite that didn't understand or care about frontier life. The very same people who had once cheered. The revolution now whispered about oppression from Philadelphia and New York instead of London. Culturally, the Whiskey Rebellion became legend in the Appalachian Hills. Stories were passed down of brave distillers standing up to federal agents. Some were exaggerated, some romanticized, but all carried the same message. Government doesn't always have your back. And if you want something done, sometimes it takes more than a vote. It takes a still, a rifle, and a few angry neighbors. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., a new capital being planned during the rebellion's aftermath, lawmakers were taking notes. Future leaders would reference the Whiskey Rebellion every time civil unrest threatened the balance of the republic. This, the model. A rapid show of force followed by clemency or a dangerous precedent of executive overreach. And then there was the whiskey itself. Ironically, despite the rebellion's failure, the tax never worked. It was expensive to enforce, widely evaded, and politically poisonous. By the early 1800s, under Jefferson's presidency, it was quietly repealed. The rebels lost the battle, but in some twisted way, they'd won the war of public opinion. The frontier didn't forget. Neither did the government. And future presidents would face their own rebellions, both large and small, with the ghost of 1794. Riding just behind them, reminding them that order is fragile, and that the republic is always one barrel away from boiling over. The Whiskey Rebellion may seem like a curious footnote today. It's a quirky chapter in the early American story, but its legacy remains surprisingly alive. Swirling like vapor off a still, influencing everything from presidential power to rural resistance. For one, it showed the American people that the Constitution wasn't just parchment and promises. It had muscle. This was the first time the federal government enforced a domestic law with troops, and the fact that it did so under the personal leadership of George Washington gave it historical gravity. Every president since has inherited that precedent. Lincoln, Eisenhower, even recent presidents deploying the National Guard during domestic unrest. All trace a faint line back to 1794 and a president on horseback. The rebellion also injected lasting skepticism into the heart of American politics. Frontier distrust of centralized government became a core part of U.S. political identity. It didn't matter that the rebellion failed. It proved to millions that distant elites could and would flex their power when it suited them. That spirit of rural defiance. You can still hear it in anti-tax protests, states' rights arguments, and the deep American love of local control. In short, the rebellion planted seeds of resistance that never quite died out. They just fermented. Whiskey itself, believe it or not, also reaped a strange legacy. Far from being demonized, it became a symbol of independence and grit. The very substance that sparked a rebellion is now toasted in bars as a proud American tradition. In fact, the American whiskey industry, especially bourbon and rye, wears its rebellious roots like a badge of honor. You'll find distilleries named after rebellion leaders, bottles designed to evoke frontier spirit, and slogans that practically dare the IRS to come knocking again. And finally, the event taught a asterisk young country something fundamental. How it responds to dissent says everything about its identity. Washington chose both force and forgiveness. That balance, power tempered by principle, became a cornerstone of the American ideal. Not always followed, of course, but always referenced. So next, time you raise a glass of bourbon or rye, remember, it's not just liquor in that bottle. It's a story of power, protest, and a young republic figuring out what kind of country it was going to be. Cheers to asterisk, the rebellion that helped define a nation. Around 1754 B.C., King Hammurabi of Babylon etched his now famous code into a massive basalt stele, a towering legal monolith meant to subject and assert divine justice. It's one of the earliest known attempts to formalize laws in human history. But buried within its 282 articles lies something just as ancient as law itself: the regulation of women. In Hammurabi's Babylon, a woman wasn't just a person. She was a role: daughter, wife, widow, mother. Each of those roles came with a legal definition, a social expectation, and if things went sideways, a punishment. For example, take marriage. Women could be married off by their fathers, essentially transferred from one household to another. Once married, a woman was expected to be faithful. If she was accused of adultery, both she and her alleged lover could be bound and thrown into a river. That's not metaphor. That's literally what the text prescribes. However, if her husband decided to spare her life, the court often agreed. Romantic in a grim sort of way. Meanwhile, if a man cheated on his wife, Hammurabi didn't seem all that concerned. Male infidelity wasn't exactly headline news in Mesopotamia. The imbalance was stark. Female honor was family honor, while male honor was more flexible. But not all the laws were oppressive. Some provisions offered women surprising protections, especially widows. A widow had the right to remain in her late husband's house and manage his property until her sons came of age. If there were no sons, she could even inherit directly. In that way, Hammurabi's code recognized a woman's capacity for financial and legal responsibility, but only within the strict bounds of family structure. There were also laws about divorce. A woman could leave her husband if he was cruel or neglectful, but proving it was no small task. If her claims couldn't be verified, she could be branded a liar and punished severely. Justice wasn't blind. It just squinted harder when the accused wore a veil. So, what did Hammurabi's code teach us about women in ancient Babylon? That they weren't invisible. Far from it. They were named, categorized, judged, and occasionally protected, but always through the lens of control. Law gave them a place, but rarely the power to shape it. Travel a few hundred miles west from Babylon, and fast forward a few centuries, and you arrive in ancient Egypt, a civilization where the scales of justice were personified by Maat, the goddess of truth, balance, and cosmic order. And unlike many of their neighbors, the Egyptians had a surprisingly progressive view, at least on paper, when it came to women's legal rights. Egyptian women, whether rich or poor, had the legal right to own property, inherit land, sue and be sued, and even initiate divorce. These weren't just theoretical rights etched on tomb walls. They were practiced, particularly in urban centers like Thebes and Memphis. Women could enter contracts, serve as witnesses, and leave wills. A woman could run a business, lend money, or purchase slaves and livestock. In short, Egyptian law recognized women as legal individuals, not just extensions of their husbands. This autonomy might seem ahead of its time, and in many ways, it was. Women weren't locked out of temples or courts. In fact, priestesses played important legal and ritual roles, and some even served as judges or scribes. Legal documents from the New Kingdom show women filing complaints against male relatives and winning. But, and there's always a but, this relative legal freedom came with social asterisk constraints. Most women still lived under the authority of a father or husband, and while they could own land, they were often expected to pass it down through male heirs. The law said yes, but society often said not quite. Marriage, though not a religious institution in Egypt, was still legally binding. Husbands and wives could divorce for reasons as varied as infertility, infidelity, or even emotional music incompatibility. Divorce didn't carry a social stigma, and children were usually cared for by the mother, who retained rights to her dowry and often received additional property. Punishment under the law was theoretically equal, but practically speaking, class and connections mattered far more than gender. A noble woman could get away with things that would send a peasant woman straight to the crocodiles, literally. So, was ancient Egypt a feminist utopia? Not exactly, but compared to the rigid patriarchies of Mesopotamia or later Greece, it offered women something rare: the ability to participate in legal life as people, not just property. In a world ruled by gods and pharaohs, that was no small thing. In ancient India, the legal world of women was governed by Dharma, the moral and social order at the heart of Hindu philosophy, codified in texts like the Manusmriti, Laws of Manu. This framework offered a deeply hierarchical and duty-driven system where women were honored, protected, and respected so long as they stayed in their place. The Manusmriti, compiled sometime between 200 BCE and 200 CE, had a lot to say about asterisk women, much of it contradictory. On one page, it declared that where women are honored, the gods rejoice. On another, it warned that a woman must never be independent. The tone swung between reverence and restriction, between divine praise and domestic captivity. Women were legally bound to male guardians throughout their lives: father during childhood, husband during marriage, and sons during widowhood. This triad of male control wasn't just cultural, it was encoded into law. Autonomy was not the ideal. Asterisk obedience was. Marriage laws were especially rigid. A woman's primary duty was to marry, bear sons, and serve her husband faithfully. Widow remarriage was generally frowned upon or outright banned, depending on the caste and period. Sati, the infamous practice where widows were expected to throw themselves onto their husband's funeral, was not universally enforced, but found moral validation in some legal and religious texts. The Manusmriti didn't command it, but it also didn't condemn it. That said, there were asterisk exceptions. Women of the upper castes sometimes received education and could inherit property in the absence of male heirs. In some regions and periods, matrilineal traditions survived, particularly in the South. Women could serve as advisors, poets, and even rulers, though these were rare and usually exceptional. Divorce was rare and generally disapproved of, though certain grounds, like impotence, cruelty, or abandonment, were sometimes recognized. Still, it was the man who had more legal freedom to cast aside a asterisk marriage. Punishments, too, were gendered. A woman caught in adultery could be disfigured or outcast. A man, he might get a fine or a slap on the wrist if he had high status. In short, ancient Hindu law wrapped women in layers of veneration and restriction. They were sacred, but sacred like a temple statue, not like a free citizen, revered, but rarely empowered. When we think of ancient Greece, we often imagine democracy, philosophy, and drama. But for half the population, women, the legal system was asterisk less about ideals and more about invisibility, especially in classical Athens. Women were legally seen not as individuals, but as permanent minors, bound to the guardianship of their nearest male relative for life. In Athenian law, Women couldn't vote, own property independently, or represent themselves in court. They could not enter contracts or even leave the house without a male escort. In many cases, if the Code of Hammurabi defined women as legally subordinate, Athens perfected the art of locking them out entirely. Asterix marriage was more of a property transaction than a romantic union. A woman's curios, usually her father or brother, arranged her marriage, and she moved into her husband's household as part of an exchange of dowies and land. Legally, she was transferred like livestock, a living, breathing asset passed between men, and yet, paradoxically, her fidelity was of enormous legal importance. If an Athenian woman committed adultery, her husband could legally divorce her immediately, and any man caught with her asterisk could be executed. Yes, executed. Without trial? The irony? Her husband could sleep with courtesans or slaves without legal repercussion. Double standards weren't just common, they were built into the legal structure. Women couldn't initiate divorce themselves, but they could return to their father's house if abandoned or mistreated. However, any legal action on their behalf had to be taken by a male relative. Even in cases of rape or assault, a woman could not bring charges. Her Kio had to speak for her. Asterisk, there were exceptions. In Sparta, women enjoyed more freedom. They could own land, receive education, and walk freely. But Spartan women were the anomaly, not the rule. In most city-states, a respectable woman's name was supposed to be spoken as little as possible. The ideal woman was modest, silent, and invisible. And yet, in the shadows of Greek law, women endured. They raised generations, managed households, and in some rare cases, wielded influence from behind the veil of legality. But officially, they weren't citizens. Asterisk, they were shadows in a system that prized logic and liberty for men only. In the world of ancient Rome, the law was a powerful instrument. And like everything else Roman, it was deeply structured, hierarchical, and pragmatic. Roman women weren't equal citizens by any stretch. But compared to their Greek counterparts, they occupied a slightly more visible and legally complex space within society. At birth, a Roman woman fell under the patriotestis or the absolute authority of her father. Upon marriage, that asterisk authority could either transfer to her husband, manus marriage, or remain with her natal family, sin manu marriage. The latter became increasingly common over time and allowed married women to retain legal nest ties to their original household and even manage property independently in some cases. This shift opened the door for women, especially widows or wealthy daughters, to own estates, manage businesses, and draft contracts. While women could not vote or hold office, they could sue in court, often with a male sponsor, act as asterisk guardians, and accumulate wealth. Still, Roman law drew a firm line around female behavior. The ideal Roman woman was pudica, modest, loyal, and obedient. Adultery, once treated as a private offense, became a public crime under Augustus' moral reforms. A woman found guilty could lose her dowry face, exile, or worse. Meanwhile, a man's infidelity remained legally unproatic. Again, patriarchy rarely missed a chance to double down. However, unique roles offered exceptions. Vestals, the virgin priestesses of asterisk Vesta, were the only women legally free from male guardianship. They swore 30 years of chastity in exchange for immense prestige, legal independence, and the power to pardon condemned prisoners. But a broken vow of chastity meant being buried alive. Divine authority came with cruel consequences. Roman matrons. Respectable married women of the upper classes held significant social power. They influenced politics through family connections, arranged marriages, and even public mourning rituals. The legal system acknowledged asterisk their status through protections for property and legal mechanisms like tutela, a type of male guardianship that by the imperial period was often symbolic. So while Roman women lived within a legal cage, the bars were spaced just far enough apart to allow movement, especially for those born into wealth and prestige. They were constrained, yes, but never entirely silenced. In ancient Hebrew society, law wasn't merely a civic structure, it was divine instruction, found in the Torah and later interpreted by rabbis. These religious legal texts created a framework that governed every aspect of life, including the roles, rights, and restrictions placed on women. And like many ancient systems, the law both elevated and limited them. Was the family unit, with women expected to serve as the moral and spiritual backbone of the household, but always under male authority. Fathers arranged marriages. Husbands were heads of households. Sons inherited land. Daughters, by contrast, were expected to marry out and bring a dowry with them, often with no inheritance rights unless there were no sons. However, women were far from voiceless. Succuba, a marriage contract, gave them legal security in the form of promised financial support and spelled out responsibilities in marriage. If a man failed to provide food, clothing, or intimacy, a woman could seek divorce, a rare provision in the ancient world. But she couldn't initiate it directly. A rabbinic court or her male kin had to advocate on her behalf. Adultery laws were starkly unequal. A married woman caught with another man could be stoned to death according to Deuteronomic law. A man caught with a married woman, same punishment. But if the woman was unmarried or a slave, the rules became murkier, usually resulting in fines or marriage depending on the social status involved. In cases of rape, the law demanded a fine and marriage to the victim, an outcome that modern readers understandably find deeply problematic. Ritual purity laws also played a massive role in how women were legally perceived. During menstruation or childbirth, women were considered ritually impure and were temporarily restricted from religious life and physical contact. These laws reinforced ideas of female otherness, not necessarily as sinful, but as symbolically set apart. And yet, the Hebrew Bible is full of strong, legally significant women. Deborah the judge, Ruth the Moabite widow, who navigates the inheritance, System and Esther, who bends royal law to save her people. These women were rare, but their presence reveals that the law wasn't always airtight, and that boldness, wisdom, and faith could sometimes make space where the law had closed a door. The Achaemenid Empire, founded by Cyrus the Great in the 6th century BCE, ruled over a vast, diverse population from Babylonians and Egyptians to Greeks and Medes. And in that sprawling empire, Persian law operated with a level of tolerance and pragmatism uncommon in many ancient societies. This legal flexibility extended in interesting ways to women. While Persian law wasn't codified in a single monument like Hammurabi's code, administrative records, court documents, and inscriptions reveal that women, especially elite women, had considerable legal presence. In particular, Persian royal and noble women were among the most autonomous in the ancient world. In the royal court, women like Atossa, daughter of Cyrus the Great and mother of Xerxes, wielded immense influence. She controlled vast estates, issued commons to administrators, and appeared in imperial inscriptions, not as decorative figures, but as landowners and power players. Records from the Pepololis fortification tablets show women receiving rations, managing work crews, and overseeing production in royal estates. These weren't isolated cases. High-ranking women, especially those close to the king, had legal authority over labor and property. Marriage and family law in Persia combined local customs with overarching imperial oversight. In Persian society, women could own property, enter contracts, and inherit land. Rights that were sometimes even more secure than in Greece or Rome. Dowries were legally protected, and women could reclaim them if the marriage ended. Divorce was possible for both men and women, though the process often leaned in favor of the husband, unless serious abuse or infertility could be proven. Punishment laws, however, were still gendered. Adultery was a capital offense, especially for women. But unlike in some neighboring cultures, the method and severity of punishment varied by class. A noblewoman might face exile or house arrest, while a servant could be executed. The law, as always, vowed to hierarchy. Zoroastrianism, the empire's dominant religion, also influenced Persian views on women. While spiritually, both men and women had roles in cosmic dualism, practical, religious. Purity laws imposed restrictions on menstruation, childbirth, and bodily contact, echoing patterns seen in Hebrew and Hindu systems. In all, Persian law offered women a curious mix: freedom through rank, respect through religion, and limits through custom. The higher your status, the louder your legal voice. In ancient China, law was not just a system of rules, it was an expression of harmony, hierarchy, and Confucian morality. And for women, this meant living within a legal and cultural framework that viewed them primarily through the lens of family roles and social duty rather than individual rights. The earliest codified Chinese laws appeared during the Zhou dynasty, but it was under the Han Dynasty 206 BCE 220 CE that legal structures began to crystallize alongside Confucian ideology. Confucian teachings emphasized the 3-0 bed. A woman must obey her father before marriage, her husband during marriage, and her sons in widowhood. This wasn't just moral advice. It influenced actual legal expectations and societal norms. Women were legally subordinate to men in nearly all contexts. They could not hold public office, rarely appeared in court independently, and were often excluded from inheritance, especially in patrilineal families. A daughter might be cherished within the home, but the law saw her as temporary. She would eventually marry out, taking her dowry with her. Marriage was both a family alliance and a legal contract. A man could divorce his wife for reasons as broad as jealousy or illness, though he could not do so if she had no family to return to, had mourned his parents properly, or had borne him sons. Women, by contrast, had no legal power to initiate divorce unless extreme abuse could be proven, and even then her case would likely depend on her male relatives stepping in. Adultery laws reflected strong gender bias. A woman caught cheating could be executed. A man cheating with a married woman might face punishment, but cheating with a servant or concubine, that was often overlooked entirely. Honor and legitimacy were tied tightly to the woman's womb. Still, there were exceptions. Some dynasties saw the rise of imperial women like Empress Lu Ji and Empress Wu, who wielded immense political power, sometimes bending legal codes to suit their ambitions. And in peasant villages, widows who managed households or took over family businesses could wield informal authority, even if the law didn't formally recognize them. In short, ancient Chinese law saw women less as autonomous beings and more as stabilizers of familial order vital to society's function, yet always second to the men who supposedly maintained its harmony. As we step back and look across the ancient world, from the ziggurats of Babylon to the palaces of Rome, from Vedic India to Confucian China, one thing becomes clear. Women were always written into the law, but rarely on their own terms. Nearly every ancient legal system assigned women a role within a male-dominated structure. Whether in Hammurabi's Code or the Manusmriti, the fundamental legal assumption was that a woman's identity was relational. Daughter, wife, mother, widow, her. Rights and responsibilities flowed through the men around her. Law defined her, but it rarely empowered her. Some civilizations like Egypt and Persia offered women more autonomy, allowing them to own property, initiate contracts, and even inherit wealth. In these societies, noble or high-born women could carve out pockets of legal authority, sometimes rivaling their male counterparts. But such privileges were far from universal. They depended on class, family, and circumstance more than any underlying belief in gender equality. Other societies like Greece and Rome developed sophisticated, legal systems while simultaneously fencing women out of public life. Greek women were legally invisible. Roman women had more agency, but still lived within a scaffold of male guardianship and social expectation. In China, Confucian values hardened the ideal of obedient femininity into legal expectation. Wasn't just about punishment, was about preserving cosmic harmony. And that meant everyone, especially women, knew their place in the social order. Similarly, in Hindu law, reverence for women coexisted uncomfortably with strict control and moral prescription. Religious laws, such as Jewish Hakka or Zoroastrian purity codes, often placed women at the intersection of sacred and profane. A woman's body could bring honor or impurity, blessing or danger, depending on how closely she followed the rules. And yet, within these systems, women adapted, resisted, and endured. They found ways to exercise influence through family, faith, property, or sheer determination. Their stories may not always be carved into stone steles or echoed in ancient law courts, but they moved beneath the surface, shaping households, dynasties, and entire civilizations. Ultimately, ancient legal codes tell us not only how societies treated women, but how they defined power itself and who they believed deserved to wield it. Long before Wall Street, before vaults and banknotes and savings accounts, banking began in the mud-brick cities of ancient Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization. And surprisingly, the first bankers weren't suited financiers. They were priests. In cities like Uruk, Lagash, and later Babylon, temples weren't just religious centers. They were the administrative and economic hearts of urban life. These towering ziggurats and their surrounding complexes acted as both spiritual sanctuaries and financial hubs. Farmers and merchants didn't just come to pray. They came to deposit grain, receive loans, and settle debts. Why temples? Because they were the most stable, trusted institutions. The gods didn't run off with your money, and the priesthood had. An army of scribes to asterisk keep meticulous records. When a farmer delivered a portion of his harvest to the temple granary, he'd receive a clay tablet with a run-uniform inscription, the quantity stored, the date, the depositor's name, and sometimes a witness. This wasn't just a receipt. It was an early form of a check. These receipts could then be transferred. A farmer in debt could hand over his tablet to a creditor as repayment. A merchant could use them to buy goods or settle accounts. In this way, the clay asterisk tablet became the ancestor of promissory notes, deposit slips. And U.S. temples also issued loans, not just in grain, but in silver, sheep, and other commodities. Interest rates were high by modern standards, typically around 20% for grain and 33% for silver. These weren't casual transactions either. Defaulting on a temple loan could lead to the loss of land, property, or even personal freedom. Interestingly, the concept of compound interest was understood and feared. Some legal codes, like those of Asterisk Hammurabi, tried to limit or regulate interest practices. Others formalized debt slavery as a punishment. This was banking in its rawest, most primal form, both brilliant and brutal. So while modern banks might be glass towers and spreadsheets, their bones are ancient. The earliest financial systems weren't born in markets, they were born in temples. And in Mesopotamia, the gods didn't just judge your soul. They also balanced your books. By the time Babylon rose to power under kings like Hammurabi Asterisk in the 18th century BCE, Mesopotamian banking had become more sophisticated and more personal. While temples and palaces remained important economic players, a new class of financial professionals began to emerge: private moneylenders. These early financiers weren't working out of marble lobbies. They conducted business in humble homes, market stalls, or even beside temple courtyards. But they had one thing temples didn't: flexibility, where temple loans were often seasonal and tied to agricultural asterisk cycles. Private moneylenders could tailor deals for merchants, traders, and craftsmen. Offering loans in silver, Babylon's preferred unit of currency. Silver wasn't minted into coins yet. That innovation would come much later. Instead, it was weighed out by the shekel, and loans were documented on clay tablets. These tablets detailed the borrower, lender, amount lent, interest rate, repayment date, and sometimes even collateral. If a debtor defaulted, lenders could legally seize land, goods, asterisk, or even family members. Some contracts read more like threats than agreements. One fascinating innovation was the rise of joint liability loans, where two or more individuals shared responsibility for repayment. This helped reduce the lender's risk and planted the seeds for what we now call co-signed loans. Debt was everywhere in Babylonian society. Farmers borrowed to plant crops. Merchants borrowed to finance caravan expeditions, and builders took loans. For large construction projects, debt slavery was a real risk, but the asterisk law eventually began to push back. Hammurabi's famous code offered some relief. For example, if a storm destroyed your crops, you might be exempted from interest that season. Babylon also introduced promissory notes and letters of credit used to transfer money across distances without transporting physical silver. These tools allowed wealthy merchants to expand, trade, and move money without the risk of robbery, a protoform of the modern banking network. It's easy to think of banking as an asterisk modern system tied to stock tickers and interest rates. But in Babylon, the same mechanics, lending, collateral, interest, and risk, were already shaping lives and livelihoods. Their tools were made of clay. Not code, but the game was much the same. In ancient Egypt, economic life revolved around two constants: the Nile River and the pharaoh's granaries. While Egypt didn't develop a formal banking system in the same way as Mesopotamia or later Greece, it nonetheless maintained sophisticated financial practices rooted asterisk in temples, royal treasuries, and massive state-administered storage systems. Instead of coins or silver shekels, Egypt's economy was built on grain. Wheat and barley weren't just food, they were currency. Taxes, wages, and debts were often measured in sacks of grain, and these were stored in vast, centralized granaries. Like Babylonian temples, Egyptian temples functioned as both religious and economic centers, serving as secure storage sites and financial record offices. Scribes recorded every asterisk delivery, withdrawal, and transaction on ostrich, pottery shards, or papyrus scrolls. These acted as receipts, contracts, and even early forms of checks. If you deposited 10 sacks of grain at the temple granary in Thebes, you might receive a receipt which could be traded or presented elsewhere to retrieve an equivalent amount, a precursor to modern bank drafts. Loans were common. The farmer might borrow seed grain to plant in the spring with the promise of repayment after the harvest, usually with interest. Rates asterisk varied, but a 25–30% interest rate on grain wasn't unusual. These loans were enforced by scribes and local officials, and default could result in the forfeit of land, livestock, or even labor. Unlike Babylon, however, private lending in Egypt was more restricted. The state played a dominant role in organizing economic exchange. High officials, priests, and royal administrators were the main actors in large-scale financial activity. Yet there are surviving records of private individuals, especially women, acting as lenders and asterisk creditors in local communities. These cases were less common, but they demonstrate a level of grassroots financial agency not often acknowledged. Coinage was introduced only during the late period, influenced by foreign powers like the Persians and later the Greeks. But even then, Egyptians preferred grain and barter systems over metal money. Proof that a functioning economy doesn't need coins, just trust, storage, and records. So, while Egypt lacked the sleek columns of a Roman bank or the aggressive contracts of Babylon, it ran a tight, temple-based economy built on grain, writing, and bureaucracy, and laid the groundwork for financial infrastructure that lasted thousands of years. With the rise of city-states like Athens and Corinth in the 5th century BCE, ancient Greece introduced two financial revolutions: the minted coin and the money changer. Unlike Mesopotamia or Egypt, where grain and silver were the dominant currencies, the Greeks embraced metal coinage as a public standard, stamped, regulated, and guaranteed by the state. This shift created a new class of financial professionals, the trapeza, named after the trapeza, or table, from which they worked in the bustling agora. These men functioned as money changers, deposit takers, lenders, and sometimes outright financiers. They exchanged foreign coins, held money for safekeeping, offered loans, and even kept accounts for their clients, a rudimentary form of checking. Need to send money to another city-state? No problem. The trapezites could issue a written draft, allowing merchants to avoid traveling with heavy, theft-prone coinage. If that sounds like a bank transfer, that's because it was, albeit with more sand and fewer algorithms. Lending was a huge part of Greek banking. Interest rates were generally high, especially for risky ventures like maritime trade. Some loans carried 100% interest, justified by the danger of shipwreck, piracy, or storm. These were backed by maritime contracts, which included details of the cargo, route, repayment, and collateral. If the ship sank, the loan was voided. If it returned, big profits. Private citizens could also act as lenders. Wealthy Athenians often invested in smaller loans secured by property or slaves. These transactions were documented before witnesses and scribes and could be enforced in court. In fact, Greek courts were flooded with debt cases, an early sign that money, trust, and lawsuits are eternal bedfellows. And yet, banks in Greece weren't formal institutions like we'd expect today. They were more like financial freelancers with serious reputations. There were no licenses, no regulation, and no government insurance. If your trapezite skipped town with your deposit, too bad. Trust was everything, and it could be shattered in a heartbeat. Despite these risks, the Greek financial world thrived. It enabled trade, supported empire building, and even bankrolled wars. In a city where logic and debate ruled, so too did contracts, ledgers, and interest rates. Ancient Greece taught us that once you stamp a coin and assign it value, the asterisk rest follows from debt and profit to risk and ruin. By the time Rome ruled the Mediterranean, banking had evolved from small-scale loans to a full-blown financial engine that powered an empire. The Romans, ever the pragmatists, didn't invent banking, but they perfected it, expanded it, and embedded it deep into the fabric of everyday life. At the heart of Roman finance were the Argentari, the Roman equivalent of bankers. These men operated out of tabernae shops near the Forum and acted as money changers, deposit takers, lenders, and agents. They exchanged coins from across the empire, held private deposits for safekeeping, paid out loans, and even executed payments between third parties. Wealthy Romans, including senators, deposited large sums with these bankers who kept ledgers, called rationes, the ancestors of our modern account books. A client could authorize a banker to pay another person using their deposit, creating an early version of the check. Want to send money to Carthage or Alexandria? No need to pack a bag of coins. Your banker could issue a letter of credit. The real fuel behind Roman banking, however, was credit. Loans weren't just for emergencies. They were used for trade, land purchases, construction projects, even election campaigns. Lending at interest, usually around 12%, though it could be higher or lower depending on risk, was legal, though subject to regulation. Usually, the charging of excessively high interest was frowned upon, but often ignored. Collateral was key. Land, slaves, or future earnings asterisk could all secure a loan. And Rome had robust legal enforcement. If you didn't pay your debts, you could be dragged to court, have your property seized, or in extreme cases, be enslaved. Unlike earlier societies, Rome allowed corporations of financiers, known as societates publicanorum, publicani, to handle large-scale government contracts, including tax collection. These were profit-seeking enterprises with investors, managers, and shareholders, making them eerily similar to modern banks and hedge funds. Yet, there were asterisk risks. Roman bankers weren't state-backed, and financial crises did happen. Records show that some banking houses collapsed, triggering waves of panic. Sound familiar? In the Roman world, money flowed through temples, forums, and estates, binding together farmers, traders, soldiers, and senators. And as the empire grew fat on conquest, its financial systems stretched like invisible roads, connecting people not with stone, but with credit, debt, and interest. Before the concept of a central bank asterisk existed, the idea of state control over currency was already revolutionizing how economies functioned. In ancient times, the power to mint coins wasn't just economic, it was political. Whoever issued the coin held the trust of the people, and that trust became the backbone of early banking systems. The earliest coins appeared in Lydia, modern-day Turkey, around 600 CE, made of electrum, a natural alloy of gold and silver. These stamped pieces marked a shift from weighed metal to standardized asterisk currency. No more measuring silver chunks in a dusty market. Now value could be verified at a glance. Other civilizations quickly adopted the idea. The Greeks minted dramas, the Persians issued dar, and the Romans built an entire empire on denarii. These coins bore state symbols, images of gods or rulers, and inscriptions, not just to represent value, but to signal legitimacy and control. A coin was as much a piece of propaganda as it was a financial tool. With state-backed coinage came new financial behaviors. Hoards of coins asterisk were stored in temples, households, and merchant treasuries. Lending became easier and more portable. Coins could circulate quickly across city-states. And with uniform weights and metal content, traders could move goods across borders with confidence. In turn, early bankers, from Mesopotamian lenders to Roman argente, adapted to this new certainty. They no longer needed to test weights or purity as frequently. Instead, they tracked coins by type, year, and issuer. This consistency reduced transaction asterisk friction, expanded trade routes, and made loans more predictable. Coinage also played a role in inflation and monetary policy, albeit in crude forms. Rulers could debase coins by mixing cheaper metals into the mix, stretching the treasury, but undermining trust. Roman emperors famously did this to pay their armies, triggering cycles of devaluation and economic instability. Still, the idea stuck. Currency backed by a state, stamped with its symbol and guaranteed in value. This concept laid the groundwork for everything from asterisk medieval gold coins to modern fiat money. In a way, each ancient coin was more than just a piece of metal. It was a promise, a contract, and a tool of empire. It told you not only how much something was worth, but who had the power to decide. In the ancient world, the line between faith and finance was often thin, if it existed at all. Temples didn't just serve the gods, they also served as the earliest safe deposit boxes, banks, and loan offices. Why? Because people trusted the gods far more than they trusted kings, asterisk merchants, or wandering moneylenders. Take Delphi, for instance. The sanctuary of Apollo wasn't just a religious destination. It was a financial powerhouse. City-states stored war funds there. Wealthy individuals deposited fortunes and treasuries were built within temple precincts. Religious centers like Delos, Ephesus, and Jerusalem also acted as de facto banks, offering security, prestige, and scribes who kept careful records. A vault under divine watch was seen as safer than any home or fortress. These temples played several financial roles. They held deposits, issued loans, and in some cases even collected interest. In Mesopotamia, as early as the 3rd millennium BCE, temple priests oversaw lending systems where borrowers repaid with grain or silver. In Egypt, temple granaries stored wealth, issued receipts, and facilitated trade. In Greece and Rome, temples frequently held public funds, safeguarded spoils of war, and underwrote construction and festivals, all under the sacred seal of a deity. And temples weren't just passive vaults, they actively lent money. In Athens, for example, the Temple of Athena on the Acropolis loaned silver to the state at interest to fund major public works. Gods apparently were patient creditors. Religion also provided the ethical framework for finance. Ancient Hebrew law, for instance, prohibited charging interest to fellow Israelites, but allowed it for foreigners, a moral boundary that blended spiritual identity with economic policy. Hindu Dharma texts, laid out rules for fair lending, debt repayment, and even the spiritual consequences of financial misconduct. Of course, these systems weren't without flaws. Temples could be looted in wartime. Clerics could be corrupt. But for most of the ancient world, temples were the most trusted institutions, enduring, stable, and reinforced by divine fear. So when you picture ancient banking, don't just imagine dusty coins and cloaked lenders. Picture golden statues, incense, and marble columns. Because for thousands of years, the safest place to put your money wasn't under a mattress. It was beneath the watchful eyes of the gods. Long before the invention of credit cards or mortgage calculators, ancient economies ran on a system that was surprisingly familiar. Borrow now, pay later with interest. Whether you were a Mesopotamian farmer, a Greek merchant, or a Roman senator, if you needed capital, you went to a lender. But the ancient rules of lending were often harsher, and the consequences of default far more personal. Interest wasn't just allowed, it was expected. In Babylon, rates were steep. 20% for grain, 33% for silver, often compounded annually. These figures weren't considered predatory. They were standard. High risk meant high reward, and borrowers understood that if the harvest failed or a caravan didn't return, they were still on the hook. Temples and private lenders alike made fortunes off these loans, and unpaid debt could lead to debt slavery or seizure of property. In ancient Greece, especially Athens, interest rates varied. Depending on the risk involved, the riskiest loans, maritime loans, a lender might front silver to fund a trading voyage, knowing the ship might sink or be seized by pirates. To offset the risk, rates could soar to 100% or more. But if the ship returned safely, both merchant and lender could make a killing. The Romans added legal muscle to these arrangements. Loan contracts were written, witnessed, and sealed. Collateral, land, goods, slaves was recorded in detail. Miss a payment, your creditor could take you to court, seize your property, or in rare cases force you into bonded labor. Roman law set a 12% interest cap, but loopholes and exemptions made that number flexible, especially during times of economic stress. Despite the risk, borrowing was common. Farmers borrowed seed. Merchants borrowed to buy goods. Politicians borrowed to fund their campaigns. Lending greased the gears of ancient economies, and default was an accepted hazard. And yes, fraud and manipulation were part of the game. Lenders sometimes demanded bribes or added administrative fees. Borrowers could lie about collateral or disappear entirely. Without credit scores or banking regulations, trust and reputation were everything. In the end, ancient loans weren't just financial tools. They were power plays. To borrow was to risk more than money. It was to stake your land, your freedom, sometimes even your family, on the chance that tomorrow would be better, or at least profitable. From grain receipts in Mesopotamia to the silver ledgers of Rome, ancient banking wasn't just a footnote in economic asterisk history. It was the foundation. These early systems of deposits, loans, interest, and financial record-keeping didn't just fuel local trade. They quietly shaped the architecture of global finance. At the heart of every ancient banking system was the same challenge we face today. Trust. Could people trust that the weight of silver was fair? That the grain in the temple granary wouldn't spoil or vanish? That the lender wouldn't disappear with their deposit? And out of that trust, or the asterisk desperate need for it, rose record-keeping, contracts, and ultimately institutional finance. The innovations were astonishing for their time. Ancient Babylonians developed loan contracts with fixed interest, repayment, terms, and legal witnesses, all inscribed in uniform. Ancient Greeks pioneered letters of credit, allowing funds to be transferred between city-states without carrying coins. The Romans created bankers' associations and formalized debt enforcement in civil law, building a financial system that could stretch from asterisk Britain to Syria. Even today, echoes of ancient banking remain. The modern check evolved from Mesopotamian. Clay receipts. The concept of collateralized loans is rooted in Babylonian and Roman practices. Central banking and monetary policy trace their ancestry back to rulers who manipulated coin purity or temple wealth to fund armies and public projects. And what about regulation? Well, it turns out ancient societies understood financial crisis all too well. In Babylon, kings periodically declared debt forgiveness to prevent asterisk social collapse. Roman emperors sometimes imposed interest caps to curb predatory lending. These weren't just economic decisions. They were political acts aimed at keeping society balanced and stable. But perhaps the greatest legacy of ancient banking is the realization that finance is not new. The tools have changed. Clay tablets became spreadsheets. Silver shekels became digital currencies. But the fundamental human behaviors remain: risk, ambition, trust, fear, and the hope of gain. The next time you log into your bank app or asterisk swipe a credit card, remember you're not doing anything new. You're participating in a system that began with scribes and temples, coins stamped by kings, and farmers betting their harvest on a better season. And it all began with a simple idea. Sometimes to build the future, you have to borrow from it.